Okay, hi. Welcome back, everyone, for Ways of Working, Comparing Colonial Economies, as we continue our examination of colonial encounters in Asia and Africa. Okay, colonial rule had a deep impact on people's ways of working. The world economy increasingly demanded Asian and African raw materials, and subsistence farming was diminishing. And there was a need to sell goods for money to pay for taxes and the desire to buy new products. Artisans were largely displaced by manufactured goods, and Asian and African merchants were squeezed out by Europeans out of those markets. So let's start with economies of coercion, forced labor, and the power of the state. Many colonial states demanded unpaid labor on public projects. The worst abuses were in the Congo Free State, personally governed by King Leopold II of Belgium, and his reign of terror killed millions with his labor demands. The forced labor caused widespread starvation as people couldn't grow their own crops, and Belgium finally stepped in and took control of the Congo in 1908 to stop the abuses. So unpaid required labor on public works is what we're talking about here. The colonial states regularly required the colonized population to supply unpaid labor to road and rail building projects, and this labor tax was greatly resented and conditions were often cruel. And King Leopold II's Congo Free State, also known as the Belgian Congo, this was the worst case of forced labor and cost millions of African lives. The state-backed private companies used a variety of abusive tactics, including mutilation, to force the local population to collect ivory and rubber. Eventually, the abuses became public, and the Belgian government took control of the colony in 1908. All right, the cultivation system of the Netherlands, East Indies, or Indonesia. The peasants had to devote at least 20% of their land to cash crops to pay as taxes, and the proceeds were sold for high profits and financed the Dutch economy. And the enriched the traditional authorities who enforced this system. So the cultivation system in the Dutch East Indies, in Southeast Asia, such as Java and Sumatra, the Netherlands forced peasants to devote, like I said, 20% of their land to cash crops, coffee, sugar, other crops like that, and sell them at low fixed prices to government contractors. And the Dutch made huge profits by selling these crops on the global market at considerably higher prices. And the system indebted many peasants to moneylenders and resulted in a series of famines in what was a very productive land. All right, many areas resisted the forced cultivation of cash crops. For example, in German East Africa, major rebellions in 1905 against the forced cotton cultivation. And in Mozambique, peasant sabotage and smuggling kept the Portuguese from achieving their goals there. So we do see resistance to cotton cultivation in East Africa, colonized by Germany. In the Portuguese Mozambique, the colonial state tried to force cotton cultivation. However, there was widespread resistance and the projects never really succeeded despite the heavy use of force. Okay, let's talk about this image. Who are these two boys? Where do you think they live? Well, based on the information that I gave you earlier, hopefully you're guessing, educated guess here, that these two boys are from the Congo Free State. Remember, ruled personally by the Belgian King Leopold II. And the chair in which the older boy sits, together with the wooden fence in the background, suggests that this picture might be taken on the grounds of a European facility, maybe a mission or a hospital, for example. And you could, just by looking at them, you can sense the growing concern about the fate of the Congolese people. So why are the hands of the two boys missing? These boys were part of a large group of Congolese forced to collect rubber for private companies. Hopefully you understand that rubber comes from a particular plant, which would then use this raw material for bicycle and automobile tires in Europe. And they failed to collect the amount of rubber demanded by the the private European companies and were punished by having their right hands chopped off. So what does this tell us about European colonialism in Africa? Well, despite the calm demeanor and the setting that you're given, the picture suggests that European colonial rule in Africa was brutal, disturbing, and infractions were punished with unspeakable cruelty. European colonization of Africa left scars on both individuals and the region as a whole that many African nations have yet to get over. Okay. Economies of crash crop agriculture, the pull of the market. All right, many people were happy to increase production for world markets. Considerable profit to small farmers in areas like Irrawaddy Delta, in Mekong Delta of the French ruled Vietnam. Rice cultivation resulted in significant environmental damage. And in the southern Gold Coast, or what's known now as Ghana, African farmers took the initiative to develop export agriculture. Became a leading supporter of cocoa by 1911. They created a hybrid peasant capitalist society. But labor shortages led to exploitation of former slaves and men marrying women for their labor power, and even the influx of migrants. Many colonies specialized in one or two cash crops, creating a dependence. So now we see the encouragement of existing cash cropping. In many colonies, there were centuries-old systems of cash cropping that the colonial states sought to encourage with expanding markets, public works, and even labor migration. And like I was talking about earlier, the rice and the Irrawaddy and Mekong deltas in British Burma, the lower Irrawaddy became a major rice exporter thanks to the public works and immigration from India and Upper Burma. And Burma saw several decades of a rising standard of living. In French Vietnam, the expansion of rice fields had a negative impact, however, and on various fish and shellfish, and it completely hurt the local diet and those ecosystems. The cocoa in the Gold Coast, along West Africa, the farmers there took the initiative and expanded production to meet new market demands. However, the labor shortage resulted in immigration from the north, which caused ethnic conflicts. All right, economies of wage labor, migration for work. So wage labor in European enterprises was common, both from colonized regions and from China and Japan. And the African migrants moved in several directions. The Atlantic slave trade continued for much of the 19th century. Internal migration grew with European empires. And Europeans took over huge tracts of African land, employing Africans as workers. And gold and diamond mines in South Africa provided employment, albeit in harsh working conditions. So now we see internal migrations to plantations, mines, and cities, and the establishment of European-run enterprises in the colonies created large movements of laborers in search of employment. And perhaps after losing their land or facing heavy taxes or loans, workers would leave their homes for work in these mines, in plantations, and even construction sites in the cities. And others might try to earn a living as servants or clerks, and life on the, for the lower echelons of society, colonial society in the mines and plantations and even in the cities was difficult, with very low wages and often brutal managers. Now in Asia, some 29 million Indians and 19 million Chinese migrated. They worked on plantations financed from Europe, also dealt with harsh conditions and high death rates. And the British facilitated migration of Indian labor to far-flung territories of their empire, especially after the end of the slave trade. So now we're talking about the international migration of Indians, Chinese, and Japanese. Filling in the labor void after the end of slavery, about 29 million Indians left their homeland to work on plantations and miners in the British colonies from East Africa to Jamaica. Now, a smaller wave of South Asians made a living as merchants, especially in British East Africa. And in addition to movement within a colony or within a specific colonial empire, large numbers of Asians moved into the a colonial world by crossing international boundaries. About 19 million Chinese sought a new life in Southeast Asia, even the Indian Ocean Basin, and the Pacific. The Malaysian rubber plantations and tin mines were staffed primarily with Chinese and some Indian workers. And so the mines were another source of wage labor, albeit it was dangerous. And the Chinese migrants settled in Manchuria, participated in the gold rushes of Australia and Peru and even California. And several states began to limit their Chinese immigration. Now, the colonial cities attracted many workers. They were seen as centers of opportunity. They were segregated, unsanitary, overcrowded. And so this created a place for a native Western educated middle class to begin to develop. And it created an enormous class of urban poor that could barely live and couldn't raise families. So now we see native labor in settler colonies. In colonies with significant white settler communities such as Algeria and South Africa and even the Kenyan highlands, the local population was frequently pushed off the land as the local state gave vast tracts of real estate to Europeans. And many of these natives were directed toward reservation-style settlements where they could seek out work on European farms or mines. And others tried to stay on their land but were viewed as squatters and not given full protection of the law. All right, let's talk about women in the colonial economy. Okay, continue to bear with me, guys. I know this is a longer section, so hang in there with me. Okay, in pre-colonial Africa, women were usually active farmers and had some economic autonomy. But in the colonial economy, women's lives diverged even more from men. Men tended to dominate the lucrative export crops, and women were left with almost all of the subsistence work. Large numbers of men, sometimes the majority of the population, migrated to work elsewhere, where women were left at home to cope, including supplying food to the men that had stayed there and those in the cities. And women coped in a variety of ways. The colonial economy also provided some opportunities to women. Men grew cash crops while women grew food. Basically, that's how it worked out. While there was much variation in the colonial economies of Africa, some patterns can be discerned. Frequently, men would turn to growing more prestigious cash crops for the market, leaving women to handle the subsistence food production back home. And work separated husbands and wives, as those men began to participate in the labor migrations to mines and cities and other farms that separated families for sometimes lengthy periods of time. And women eventually became the head of household, or heads of households. Without the male head of the household, many women became the leader, giving them a newfound agency and even some independence. Now, especially small trade and marketing was a part of the colonial economy that provided the new opportunities to women. Sometimes women's crops came to have greater cash value, and some women escaped the patriarchy of husbands or fathers, but also led to greater fear of witchcraft and efforts to restrict female travel and sexuality. Now let's assess the colonial developments. Now the overall economic impact of colonial rule. Let's look at that. So defenders, well, it jump-started modern growth. Okay. But the critics say that there's a long record of exploitation, and this growth is actually limited and rather uneven. So, jumpstart or exploitation? There remains much debate on the role of colonialism in the world's economic development. Proponents and apologists argue that it set key processes in motion, while critics point to exploitation and uneven development. And despite the debates, 3 points remain clear. And, colonial rule did help integrate Asian and African economies into a global exchange network. And the colonial rule did introduce some modernizing elements, like administrative and bureaucratic structures, communication or transportation infrastructure, even schools and healthcare. But the colonial rule did not lead to breakthroughs to modern industrial societies like they did elsewhere. So this global integration, is it for better or for worse? Colonialism did speed up global economic integration, but some elements of modernization, The various degrees of modernity did trickle into the colonial world. But like I said, no colonial breakthrough to modern industrial economy. And it didn't develop to complete the industrial transformation like they did, for example, in Japan. And that is the conclusion of Chapter 18, Section 4, Ways of Working, Comparing Colonial Economies. I'll see you guys again for Believing and Belonging, Identity and Culture Change in the Colonial Era.